I am Lenrod Nzulu Baraka, founder of Afro-Caribbean Spiritual Teaching Center and Children of Kush publications. These two organizations are dedicated to creating a paradigm shift in Black thought. My main objective is to challenge people of African ancestry to think outside the box of Jewish, Christian, European, and Islamic thought. I seek to achieve this objective by writing and circulating articles among people of African ancestry here in the Caribbean, and hopefully we expect these articles eventually to go as far as the wider African diaspora and onto the continent of Africa as well. Then we also publish videos on social media like this one. And thirdly, we publish and circulate books by Children of Kush publications. Children of Kush publications is currently expanding and promoting a series of books entitled Secrets Your Church Won't Tell You. The 8 books in the series are: number 1, The Rebirth of Black Civilization, Making Africa and the Caribbean Great Again. Number 2, The Future of Africa and the Caribbean, Challenges and Possibilities. Number 3, Oreos, Coconuts and Negropeans, Rediscovering Our African Identity. Number 4, Out of Babylon, Why Black People Should Leave Most Churches. Number 5, Fortified Chicken Broth for Black Souls, Secrets Your Church Won't Tell You. Number 6, The Grand Failure, How Christianity Became a Force for Evil in the World. Number 7, Is God a Moral Monster? And finally, number 8, The Church That Changed Its God, The Rise and Fall of Seventh-day Adventism. The 8 books are available from Amazon Kindle Store as ebooks and in hard copy. To see a full listing of books from Children of Kush publication, you can go to my Amazon author page, which is amazon.com/author/Leonard Phillips. Let me repeat that again. Amazon.com/author/Leonard Phillips, and it's all in lowercase. Or you can type in Leonard R. Phillips or Lenrod Nzulu Baraka, or the title of the books you are interested in on the Amazon Kindle search page. To watch more of my videos on YouTube, just type in Lenrod Nzulu Baraka in the YouTube search bar. And please remember, don't forget to like, to subscribe, and to share my YouTube videos with all your friends and contacts in the diaspora and on the continent of Africa. Your support for this initiative is greatly appreciated. I am Lenrod Nzulu Baraka, reminding you that the more you learn, the more you realize how little you really know. Asante sana, which is Kiswahili for thank you. Recently, I was listening to a radio program on an FM station, and the program was discussing some of the social problems affecting Barbados. Now, the program was sponsored by an Evangelical Christian group, and on the program you had 3 different viewpoints being represented. Number 1, you had the viewpoint of Evangelical Christians in Barbados. Then there was a representative of the Rastafarian community, and there was also a representative from the Nation of Islam on the panel on the radio program. The common trend in all three of the viewpoints represented on the program was an inherent challenge to the Enlightenment ideal of extending human rights to all human beings. Fundamentalists in all religions are mounting a challenge to the Enlightenment ideals at the heart of liberal democracy. And the reason why fundamentalists are mounting their challenge, they believe that the Enlightenment ideals run contrary to absolute morals and values, especially the absolute morals and values contained within their sacred books and enunciated by the deities of their particular faiths. As a result of this, religious fundamentalists must therefore wage jihad or warfare against secular value systems. So the culture war that we are seeing being waged in North America, in Europe, and also in the Caribbean is nothing more than a clash between these two systems of values. Now, over the years, I have become quite passionate about studying the future, and that passion has led me to delve into the writings of some of the most prominent futurists of our day, people like Alvin Toffler, who wrote that seminal futurist work, a trilogy of books, including Future Shock, Third Wave, and Power Shift. Then there is John Nesbitt. John Nesbitt helped to popularize the idea of megatrends. Ray Kurzweil, he writes a lot about changes in technology. What are some of the exciting new developments that we can anticipate in robotics and other cutting edge technologies? Juan Enriquez wrote an excellent book, As the Future Catches You, where he looks at a lot of the trends that are taking place in the world of technology, especially in the area of genetics. And then, of course, there is the Japanese physicist Machio Kaku, who writes a lot about technology as well, what we can anticipate in the near future as well as the far off future in many different aspects of technology. Alvin Toffler, in his book Future Shock, makes the interesting point. He says that future shock occurs when changes happen so fast that people cannot keep up and cope with the acceleration in the rate of change. So, future shock is built on the premise that we are in a period of accelerated change. The rate of change has accelerated. We're getting new developments and they're coming at us fast and furious. Now, Toffler argues that because change is coming at such a fast and furious rate that many people are unable to keep up with the rate of change, hence the term future shock. Futurism is the study of the future, and what it seeks to do is to focus our attention on many of the different changes that will take place in all of the important aspects of our life. Now, in the area of science and technology, I remember as a boy watching sci-fi programs like Star Trek. And you would also remember that in Star Trek, you had two very interesting technologies. Number one, you would see Mr. Spock and Captain Kirk with these little handheld devices that they would be communicating with people on the Enterprise or people other places. Now today, the smallest child in Barbados and in the Caribbean can be seen walking around with a little device in their hand, which they use to communicate with people all over the world. I'm talking, of course, about the cell phone. So that's one area in which technology has got it with science fiction. I'm rather hoping that the other uh, example of science and technology in Star Trek will actually occur in my lifetime. That is the whole idea of teleportation. I rather look forward to the idea or the time when I'll be able to just think and I'll just disappear from one place and appear someplace completely different. I rather suspect that that technology is quite possible, and as we put our minds to it, as is found in the old scriptures written by Moses, nothing that man puts his hand to do will be restrained from him. I believe that our science and technology can get us to that point. Then, of course, in the area of politics, I mean, we've witnessed some very dramatic changes over the past 50 to 100 years in politics. For much of the last century, the world was dominated by two political ideologies, communism and capitalism. Then, of course, in the late 80s, late 90s, in the last decade, we saw the explosive collapse of the communist system, which then gave birth to a world controlled by one superpower, namely the US. Now, in the last 50 to 75 years, we've also seen some very interesting social changes as well. Starting in the 50s, you had the Black Power revolutions, where countries in Africa and the Caribbean challenged the European powers gaining their independence. And you had people of African ancestry then in the diaspora beginning to fight for their individual human rights. Of course, after the era of the Black Revolution, you had the feminist revolution, where now women started to clamor for their own personal human rights. And the feminist revolution then was followed by the LGBTQ revolution, where members of the LGBTQ community started also to clamor for individual human rights. So we've seen some very dramatic social changes, um, same-sex marriage, gender fluidity. All of these are concepts that today's people need to be aware of and come to grips with. Then, of course, with the coronavirus, that introduced most of us to a trend that had already been taking place, in that in many countries, education has already been uh, delivered in a technological package. Whereas instead of you having to leave your country to go to universities, now you can do your studies online. Of course, with the coronavirus and the shutdown of many countries, it meant that schools were no longer operating. So many parents and children who were not perhaps aware of the new trend in distance learning became very familiar with the concept of distant learning, because uh, children had to go online to gain access to their teachers. And of course, in entertainment, we've seen some very interesting changes. If you look at personal entertainment, I remember the days when if you want to watch a movie, you had to go into the cinema. Then, of course, came the video revolution, where everybody bought a video player. And we used to go to the video shops and rent movies on video. Then videos disappeared and you had DVDs. Now, today, to get your personal entertainment, you stream it online. And it is believed that as more countries roll out their 5G technology, we will see some new exciting modes of entertainment transfer globally. Now, you will notice I didn't mention religion in the last list, and that's because I want to speak about religion especially. Now, whenever I talk to people about religion, one of the first things I like to remind people of is the fact that your religious affiliation is closely related to the place of your birth. The accident of your birth predisposed you to the religious ideology that you are so firmly attached to. For example, if you were born in India, uh, there's a high probability that you would either be a Hindu, a Muslim, or Sikh. If you were born in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, or Iran, Islam would have been your first choice, and in many cases, your only choice. If you were born in Europe, North or South America, perhaps you most likely would have been either Catholic or Protestant. Or if you were born, let's say, within the last 40 years, there's also a good possibility that you could be unaffiliated, because the unaffiliated seem to be the fastest growing group in both Europe and in North America right now. In Africa, if you were born in Africa, there was a high probability that you would be a Christian, a Muslim, or a practitioner of traditional African religion. And for us here in the Caribbean, our choices are you either be a Christian, you practice some form of Afro-Caribbean religion, you're a Muslim, or you're Hindu. So the place of your birth predisposes you to your religious conditioning. This brings us to some of the interesting trends in the Abrahamic faith. Now, if you look at Judaism, you find that right now, just this morning, I was listening to BBC, and they were giving some coverage on the ongoing conflict in the Gaza Strip. Apparently, I think it was either one or two Jews were killed recently, and that has sparked off some unrest among the settler community. And some Orthodox Jews are calling for massive reprisals and retaliation against the Arab community. Some have gone so far as to say that a number of Arab villages need to be burnt. Now, I keep telling people that the Arab-Israeli conflict has the potential for genocide. And I am of the opinion that the Jews will not be the victims in this genocide. Now, part of the big problem in terms of the Arab-Israeli conflict happens to be the fact that religion is fueling that conflict. Jews believe that they are God's favorites. The Arabs believe that they are Allah's favorites. And so these two contrasting religious ideologies are in conflict. And of course, what is making the conflict even more explosive is the fact that Christian fundamentalists have weighed in and are of the opinion that the Jews should continue to push to make sure that they are in control of as much of the territory of Israel as is possible, because they believe that this is all a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Now, if you are familiar with the tenets of dispensationalist prophetic interpretation, you would know that Evangelical Christians place the establishment of Israel as a nation in Palestine in 1948 as a fulfillment of Bible prophecy as they see it. Now, they believe that the state of Israel needs to be restored in its land of birth, which is in Palestine. And they also are of the opinion that the religious ceremonies and the temple of Israel needs to be rebuilt. And that in itself has potential for great strife in the Middle East. Because if you know anything about Jerusalem, for example, you would know that Jerusalem has some holy sites for both Christians, Muslims, and for Jews. The Dome of the Rock right now is situated on the site where many people believe was the former site of the Jewish temple. Now, if dispensationalists and some Orthodox Jews believe that the temple needs to be rebuilt on the original site, then it means that the present structure that is standing on the old site would have to be removed, which would be the Dome of the Rock. Now, you can see the problem that that would pose right away. The Dome of the Rock is the second most holy site in Islam in the world. If an accident were to happen to the Dome of the Rock, what do you think Muslims around the world would do? Now, if they're willing to start riots because of people burning the Quran or drawing pictures of Prophet Muhammad, what do you think Muslims around the world would be willing to do if an accident were to occur to the second most holy site of Islam in the entire world? I see the Arab-Israeli conflict to be a conflict that has great potential for human misery and suffering. Then, of course, in Islam, you have, in recent times, we've had the multiplication of what are called by the Muslim self-chosen martyrdoms. Of course, the Western press calls them suicide bombers. Um, Muslims, on the other hand, when these young men sacrifice their lives, Muslims see it more as martyrdom than as acts of terrorism. And they always say terrorist, freedom fighter, it all depends on which side of the fence you are on. And then, of course, in Christianity, some of the interesting trends that we've been witnessing in recent times, we've talked on this channel about Reconstructionism and Dominionism, where you have Christian evangelicals trying their best to reform societies using Bible law, using the law of Moses as their reform mechanism. In other words, they're trying to get the laws of the Bible to become the laws of the land in countries which they say are supposed to be Christian nations. The US being one, Christian evangelicals are claiming that the US is a Christian nation. And interestingly enough, we have the same claims being made by people here in the Caribbean. Now, it was this kind of radical fundamentalism which joined forces with the Republican Party and white nationalists to produce the phenomena which we refer to as Trumpism. Now, this brings us back to one of our futurists, Mr. Alvin Toffler. Now, in the third of his trilogy, Power Shift, Alvin Toffler makes the point that there are forces in the contemporary world that are seeking to restore the monopoly control that religion had in pre-Enlightenment times. Now, if you are familiar with European history, you would know that there was a period in European history, maybe from the 4th century to maybe around the time of the Enlightenment, when the church ruled Europe basically with an iron glove. There wasn't any form of learning, there were no ideas that could be put forward that the church did not approve of. Any individual who went against the uh, thought patterns expressed by the church could be hauled before church courts known as the Inquisition, and they could be tried for heresy. And in many cases, people, as a result of charges of heresy being leveled against them, very often these people would lose their lives in some of the most horrendous of forms, including, of course, being burnt at the stake. Now, it was during this time that the church waged relentless war against all forms of pre-Christian learning. So, pagan temples were burnt, books which contain invaluable scientific information were destroyed. Christians did everything they could to get rid of all forms of knowledge which deviated in any way from the Bible, and in doing that, they basically put out the light of learning in Europe, resulting in what historians refer to as the Dark Age. So Toffler says that there are forces in the contemporary world that are seeking to restore the monopoly and control that religion had in pre-Enlightenment times. In the book Power Shift, page 368, Toffler makes this very revealing statement. He says, religion is not the enemy of democracy. In a secular, multi-religious society with a clear separation of church and state, the variety of beliefs and non-beliefs add to the vibrance and dynamism of democracy. So Toffler is laying the case for the fact that religion in itself is not an enemy of democracy. As a matter of fact, he says where there's pluralism in religion, that adds to the vibrance and dynamism of democracy. Religions and denominations of religion that are tolerant of diversity are very compatible with democracy and freedom. For example, it is highly unlikely that you would see a group of Anglicans out picketing against LGBTQ being granted rights in a community. You're not likely to see an Anglican cleric bombing an abortion clinic. As a matter of fact, if you would remember well, the Anglican or the Episcopal Church was the first major religious denomination that opened its doors to the LGBTQ community. As a matter of fact, you would remember the great scandal that was occasioned by the elevation of Gene Robinson to the position of bishop in the Anglican Church, when it was a known fact that Gene Robinson was an openly gay cleric. So the Anglican Church basically had the view of live and let live. The Anglican Church was not in the business of getting into people's bedrooms or getting into people's private lives. That was a matter between the person and God. They and God would work it out somehow. The Anglican Church, was not getting into that. Religious fundamentalists, on the other hand, those who insist that the way of their deity is the only way, in other words, it is our way or the highway, are forced to wage war with democracy and freedom. Religious fundamentalists, by virtue of the fact that they see only one way as being tolerable, must wage war against democracy, which says always can be entertained. That is what creates the tension between religious fundamentalism and liberal democracies. Now, continuing with Toffler, Toffler makes a very interesting point. He said that there are two factors which he called a lethal combination. What are these two factors? Toffler talks about organizations that are universalistic and totalistic. Now, what does Toffler mean by these two terms? Now, when he talks about a universalistic institution, he's talking about a religion that believes that it has a mandate from its deity to spread its doctrines all over the world and to embrace every human being. In other words, it's a universal faith. It's a faith that is supposed to be embraced by all human beings. So that's the first thing. He says that's the first of the lethal combination, universalistic. And of course, examples of a universalistic faith would be fundamentalist Christians. Very, very universalistic. They believe that their viewpoint is the only viewpoint, and this is the viewpoint that every individual under the setting of the sun or the rising of the sun must embrace or suffer consequences. Then, of course, you have fundamentalist Muslims who also believe that Islam is the right faith and that everybody must convert to Islam at some point or the other or face the consequences. And in the historical context, this brought fundamentalist Christians and fundamentalist Muslims onto the battlefield in what were known as the Crusades, which resulted in rivers of blood in the Middle East and in Europe, wherever these two fundamentalist groups met each other on the battlefield. And then the other part of the lethal combination, totalists. meaning religions that insist on totalitarian control over every aspect of the the lives of their members. And a classic example would be the Jim Jones suicide saga that took place in Guyana many years ago. Now, you know, you have to be in total control of the people in your religion or in your church. Man, you could get them to drink poison and they meekly comply like little lambs. So after making the point about the lethal combination, Toffler goes on to make this point on page 368 of PowerShift. He says, yet some of the fastest growing and most powerful religious movements today exhibit this lethal combination. In other words, what Toffler is saying is that the fastest growing religious groups are groups which combine the lethal combination of universalism and totalitarianism. Toffler continues, he says, they are determined to seize power over the lives and minds of whole nations, continents, the planet itself, determined to impose their own rule over every aspect of human life, determined to seize state power wherever they can, and to roll back the freedoms that democracy makes possible. They are the agents of the new dark age. So here Toffler makes a case for the fact that fundamentalists who combine the lethal combination of universalism and totalism are potentially threatening to make war with freedom and democracy and take us back to a new dark age. Now, the Caribbean happens to be a very cosmopolitan region. Within the Caribbean, you can find many different ethnicities. You have the indigenous or the first citizens. These were the people that Mr. Columbus met when he got lost and ended up in Hispaniola. And of course, the genocidally minded Christopher Columbus, when he met the Indians for the first time, the first thought that Columbus had in his mind, according to some historical records, was that with a few men he would be able to take control of them and enslave them. And so said, so done. In a very short space of time, the Europeans under Columbus busied themselves in enslaving the first citizens of the New World. Of course, the first citizens were unable to handle the horrors of the regime implemented by the Europeans, and so many of them started to die, especially from the new diseases that the Europeans introduced into the New World. So they not only had to deal with the rapacious and the lasciviousness of the European invaders who inflicted themselves on the indigenous women as much as they wanted to, but they also came bearing many European diseases against which the indigenous population had little defense against. And it took a Catholic priest by the name of Bartholomew de las Casas. Las Casas, as he saw what was happening, the widespread death and destruction of the Indians or the first citizens in the New World, he wrote to the Spanish sovereign and begged that something be done to protect the first citizens in the New World. Incidentally, it was also Bartholomew de las Casas who inadvertently was responsible for the introduction of Africans into the New World, because Las Casas suggested that Africans who were much sturdier than the Indians could be used as a replacement source of labor for the European plantations in the New World. And of course, that opened the door then to the transatlantic slavery and all of the horrors of the Black Holocaust. So you had the indigenous people, and you have the descendants of enslaved Africans who make up the majority of people in most of the Caribbean countries. I understand that Guyana and Trinidad are two exceptions, where East Indians now constitute a majority In Guyana, I think the last statistics I looked at said that Indo-Guyanese represent 39.8% of the Guyanese population, while Afro-Guyanese represent 29.2% of the population. And then in Trinidad, you have East Indians constituting 35.4% of the population, while Afro-Trinidadians representing 34.2. So I drew those statistics to your mind, especially to the Afro community in Guyana and Trinidad, to let you know that you have some work to do. Now, I do not subscribe to the evangelical conception of restricting abortion rights to women. But I do understand that there's some validity to the argument that no ethnic group can shrink their way to greatness. Now, if you look at what is happening in North America, African Americans used to be the largest minority in North America, but now they've been replaced by Hispanics. And a part of the reason it is believed why the numbers of African Americans in North America have declined is because of the widespread availability of abortion, especially in Black communities. So I'm just saying a word to the wise is always sufficient. At least it should be sufficient. Then you have Europeans, you have Indians. Indians were brought into the Caribbean as a way of supplementing the labor force, especially after emancipation. The same thing happened with Chinese. Chinese were also brought into the Caribbean as a part of the labor force. And then, of course, Jews. Jews, because of the bad treatment they received all over the world, especially in Europe, were always looking for new places to set up shop. And so many Jews came into the Caribbean. Now, here's a little historical note for people of Barbadian ancestry. Now, in Barbados, you would know that the two main commercial streets are Broad Street and Swan Street. Broad Street traditionally has been the center of white Barbadian economic power, whereas Swan Street now today is considered to be the playground of Indo-Barbadians. But before Swan Street was named Swan Street, it used to be called Jew Street because Jews used to control most of the trading that took place in that particular street, the second most important street in Barbados. Then, of course, we have Syrians here, we have Japanese, and of course, there are many other groups. So the Caribbean is really a very ethnically diverse region. The Caribbean also is what I like to call a cultural potpourri. Just last week, Trinidad celebrated its carnival, one of the great spectacles of the world, perhaps second only to the carnival in Rio. Then I remember when I lived in Trinidad, every year you would have not only carnival, but you would have the Diwali festival, you had Eden Figure. There were lots of different religious festivals. There were many different cultural festivals. The Caribbean is full of different norms, full of different values, ideas, and of course, many different religions. Now, the Caribbean, as I said a little earlier, has a Black majority in most of the islands, Guyana and Trinidad being the exceptions. And within the Caribbean, what determined the religious orientation of the people usually was the European nation that colonized the various islands. For example, the islands that were colonized by Britain tended to be Protestant in their orientation, which meant that the various religions that had their origins in England were the main religions that you found in those colonies that were settled by the British. Of course, the Anglican Church would have been the most prominent of all of the denominations that would have been introduced by the English into the English-speaking Caribbean. Then, of course, the countries that were settled by the French, the Portuguese, and the Spanish, because they had a Catholic orientation, most of these islands would have followed the Catholic tradition. So you had the Anglican in the British speaking countries, and of course, in the Catholic speaking countries, you had the Catholic Church being the dominant religious force. Now, in addition to the Anglicans and the Catholics, there were also many other Protestant sects, including Pentecostals, Methodists, Moravians, Nazarenes, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, and a host of other Christian denominations. There are also a number of fusions between the Christianity and traditional African spirituality, including the spiritual Baptist, Orisha Shango, Rastafarianism, Santeria, Voodoo, and Obe. So as you can see, the Caribbean is not only ethnically diverse, it is also religiously diverse. Many different religious traditions. In 1969, the government of Barbados decided that it would disestablish the Anglican Church. Now, the disestablishment of religion meant that there would no longer be a state church in Barbados. Now, I suspect that this holds true for most, if not all, of the other islands of the Caribbean. Now, the Caribbean churches generally are respected and given free rein to pursue their spiritual objectives, providing they do not endanger public health, security, and the general welfare of the islands of the Caribbean. Religion is respected very much and honored very much in the Caribbean, but the least that Caribbean governments ask of religions is that they not endanger public health, security, or the general welfare of the various islands. Now, against the backdrop of the cosmopolitan, the religious pluralism, the ethnic and cultural variety that exists in the Caribbean, it is a cause of great concern when local religious clerics and other religiously motivated individuals start clamoring for the favor and protection of their brand of spirituality by the state. In the build-up to Barbados becoming a republic, the government introduced a new charter which used the word creator instead of God. Now, this shift in terminology resulted in some evangelical Christians nearly losing their minds. And this occurred notwithstanding the reality that the term creator was more inclusive, since most non-Christian religions also believe in a creator. It meant that if you were not a Christian, and you heard the term creator, you would not feel excluded because your religion also believes in a creator. And so the government of Barbados, in its wisdom, thought to use the more inclusive term creator, but that created quite a hailstorm of controversy among evangelical Christians who wanted the government to go back to using the term God. And many of them use the very same argument that Christian fundamentalists use in North America and other places, namely that the Christian evangelicals in the US say that the US is a Christian nation. And they know that is so because God is mentioned in some of the founding documents of the nation. So likewise in Barbados, people referred to the national anthem which says the Lord has been the people's guide for the past 300 years. So the evangelicals said, you see, Barbados in its founding documents make the claim that Barbados is a Christian nation. So therefore, when Barbados is talking about the supreme being, we should use the term God, not a generic term like creator. Now the question arises, why should Christian denominations be demanding that the government of Barbados champion their unique definition and name for deity? especially since there's a variety of opinions about deity among the general body of Christians. For example, some Christians believe that deity is a composite union of three in one, referred to as the Trinity concept, while others believe that they're following Jesus and teach that deity is one being, namely the one Jesus called his Father and the only true God according to the Gospel of St. John 17 and verse 3. Therefore, instead of clamoring for a concept of deity that was rejected by Jesus according to some Christians and all of the Jews in the Bible definitively, would the cause of evangelical Christians not be better served if they could sit down with other Christians and work out their theological differences? Neither are the numerous sexual scandals involving high-ranking evangelicals helping the cause of this group of Christians either. Christian fundamentalists should take to heart the biblical admonition which states that Christians should render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Christian fundamentalists should therefore busy themselves cleaning up their own house while leaving the task of creating a more free, fair, and equitable society to our duly elected political leaders. And so, to summarize and a few takeaway points. We've seen that organized religion is trying to restore its lost glory and power, not only in the outside world, but also here in the Caribbean as well. Christian fundamentalists are trying to hijack political power wherever they can and reinstate their brand of religious hegemony. Religious fundamentalists are waging a culture war against Enlightenment ideals. This religious culture war is also being fought right here in the Caribbean. So what are some of the takeaways from this presentation? If hardcore religious fundamentalists have their way, the torch of freedom and democracy could very well be extinguished in the Caribbean and around the world. Religious fundamentalism therefore needs to be restrained within the Caribbean and in the wider global setting. And lastly, freedom of religion needs to be better promoted by both secular and religious organizations. I'm Lenrod Nzulu Baraka, reminding you that our world would be a better place if fewer people had doctorates in stupidity and ignorance. Asante sana na kwaheri, which is Kish Swahili for thank you very much and goodbye.